Well, from today, we are going to take up the topic of the Upanishads. And I'm sure all of you here have heard much about it, and some may have even studied it, some may have even learned a few Upanishads like the Isha. But we have chosen to take up the Upanishad, the Isha Upanishad. Of course, time permitting, health permitting, time permitting, we can do many Upanishads starting with the Isha. But what I would like to do today is not to jump straight into the Isha, because I would like you to understand from an Indian perspective what exactly is the position of Isha or position of the Upanishads in the Indian spiritual context. Because unless and until you understand its placement in the spiritual history of India, you will not appreciate it much. Of course, if you go into your internet and website, you will see so many Western philosophers, German philosophers, and British and American and French. Everyone has been influenced by, including Plato, including Socrates. I mean, you read Aurobindo and he'll tell you the lines that appear in Plato, which have been taken from the Upanishads. Of course, it's not a question of superiority or inferiority, but it's a question of the extent of the Upanishadic influence all over the world, and especially in the West in those early days where philosophy was really rampant with the coming of Socrates. So in a way, we see Upanishads has influenced the thought of the whole world, directly or indirectly. It's a manner that people are now digging up every great man, every great philosopher, every great poet, even the recent one, T.S. Eliot, who openly used the Upanishadic terms. So I would like you to understand what is exactly the contribution of the Upanishads. You see, Aurobindo would trace the spiritual history of India to three phases, three periods. What he calls the Vedic period, that, of course, there is scholars can differ on that, but the closest that the scholars can tell us is about 10,000 years BC. The Vedas existed a minimum of 10,000 years, 10,000 BC. At a time when the world, perhaps many of the countries were not even born, many of the cultures did not even start. So it was a time where the life was simple, agrarian, and yet here were some rishis, some spiritual stalwarts, who sought to give the highest inspiration in spiritual life. It's a bit odd to think that in the beginning of civilization, where people did not even know much about knowledge and writing and reading, but here comes a group of rishis who have not given us the truth. Please remember, it is not that they were great poets or writers or authors or thinkers. No, there were none of this. And yet, they heard the truth, what we call the Shruti. Shruti is to hear. They heard the truth. That means the truth that was revealed to them through their ears. So each of these verses that are given in the Vedas were truths that were heard. And truths about what? About the Supreme Reality. You see, it's really interesting to see how a culture begins with the greatest knowledge of the self, of the reality, of Brahman. They did not think about what do I do next meal, how do I really cultivate this, or how do I get my good earning or good house, or nothing. Because fundamentally, Indian culture thought about this truth. There's a famous story of a Buddhist monk who went to meet Socrates. Not to meet, but they met. And the monk asked Socrates what exactly is his thought or his philosophy. But Socrates seems to have replied, it is wanting to know the nature of man. Then the Buddhist monk said, how can you know the nature of man without knowing the nature of the Supreme, the Creator? You see, this of course is a little anecdote to tell us that right from the beginning the emphasis was to know the Supreme, the Creator first. By knowing the whole, by knowing the all, then only you will come to know the parts, the finite things, the innumerable finite things. But we must have first of all the global picture, the total picture. So this is what is interesting about the Vedic rishis, that they gave us a picture and understanding of the Brahman. Brahman, whom they call as the Creator. And of course, once you get into the Brahman, we are going to see the different aspects. But what's interesting is, what is the nature of Brahman? And how did he manifest this universe, this world of forms? You see, they were really focusing themselves on the Creator and the created. They did not get into the nitty-gritty of daily life of the individuals. They were still at the knowledge level. And this knowledge, as I told you in the beginning, they didn't create, they didn't imagine. They, in their deep meditations, heard these truths. And whatever they heard, they noted down. And Aurobindo would tell us, these are called revelations, not even intuitions. Revelations are higher than intuitions. The source of revelation is higher in the plane of consciousness. But these revelations were cryptic, language heavily symbolic, and the imagery drawn from the day-to-day life of that period. So it was relevant to the common man that the imagery of the cows and the horses and the trees and the nature and the sun and the God and the wind, all these were images that were drawn into those revelations. So it was a wonderful truth which connected the common man to the divine. And the entire purpose of the Vedas, not the entire, I would say, the central purpose of the Vedas was how to connect man with God. You see, that's why, It has been said, you may believe it or not, sometimes it's difficult to believe, that the foundations of Indian culture are spiritual thus and thereby. Because right from man, the very first man who thought of Indian culture said how to connect human beings to the divine. What are the different ways? So he was not bothered about how to live. He was more bothered about how to connect to the divine. And who is the divine? This is the divine. How to connect this world to the divine. But one side there is knowledge, but other side people say, how do I connect? I need to do something. You see, we are all living in Aurobindo with a great ideal of human unity. We are not just meditating here. We are doing, there's an action. It is through action we express human unity. So they also said we must have some activity and action through which we can connect with the divine or with the gods. And those activities and actions turned out to be rituals, processes, yajnas. And all these things were given to the common man as symbolic gestures of your connection to the divine. And they were indeed very powerful. They were not just prayers. Aurobindo himself would emphasize on this, that the Vedic verses they are not intellectual, as I said, they are not poetry, but as they were heard, each of this word is an irreplaceable word. You cannot logically maintain this word is better than the other. That's what K.D. Setan had tried to do with Sriaurobinda Savitri. They're trying to say, hey, logically this word seems to be better than what you used. Sriaurobinda said, I'm sorry, this is what I have heard. With Sriaurobinda, it is what he saw. Not even heard, he saw these lines in front of him. So he says, I've seen this, it's not something I've created just because you critical literary critics would say, this sounds better, that rhymes better. He says, it's not the logic that works. It is, I've seen, I've heard, Tompi, voila, c'est fini. So this is the beauty of the Vedas, that every word is irreplaceable, is a symbol, is mantric, carries the vibration to such an extent that there are many stories where a mispronunciation or a misapplication leads to catastrophe. Because one word missed and replaced by something else, the meaning changes completely. So they are, it's like chemistry. Instead of H2O, if you put H3O, the whole chemical output is different. You may say it's only H2 and H3. No, you cannot. Similarly, in the Vedas, every syllable has that irreplaceable reality. So there is a perfect perfection of word and rhythm and imagery and power of manifestation. And secondly, these are mantras given to connect to the divine. And thirdly, they oriented the individual life towards Godhead throughout the day. The beauty is not that you go to temple once a week and on a Saturday, on a Monday at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, you go to church, finito. No. That is religiosity, where once a week becomes a habit, you have to go to church or mosque or to temple. But here they gave us practices right from the sunrise to the sunset to the midnight. What are you supposed to do during the day? And this is what many of Aurobindonian disciples ask us to say, hey, what am I supposed to do? Because we are all wanting to do something. So the Vedas gave us You may call them the rituals, which turned out to be. Over centuries, this knowledge lasted, these rituals lasted. But as it happens with all human society, whatever is the great truth, it becomes a practical reality and then an outward meaning only. You lose the essence, you keep to the ritual. And unfortunately, this is what had happened in a society, in those early Indian society, in that early Indian society also. So there was a danger of losing the Vedas, the truth of the Veda. If you asked a Brahmin what is the reciting, he won't know the meaning. You say, these are the verses, these are the things that I'm supposed to recite during a marriage, during the food, during this, during that. So this came to disconnect human society to the Godheads. And then come the Vedic Upanishadic rishis. That is a conscious building in, coming in of the rishis of the Vedic, of the Upanishadic period. That's the second round. They really felt this danger of the disappearance of the Vedas. But what was the cause of this disappearance of the Vedas? Experience. Non-experience, not experience. That if you do not practice and realize the Vedic truths and only practice the rituals and the formalities, obviously you lose the experience, you don't get it, and you will lose the spirit and the power. That is the truth with every spiritual institution. We may take up the outer shell, the outer practices, and then that's what lands up in rituals. And we forget our guru, we forget the spiritual master. He is there more as a name, as a photograph, as a puja. So the Upanishadic truth rishis said, no, we have to go back to the experience of the Vedic rishis. And what they did, at one go they swept away all the rituals. First, let's get rid of the evil. That is the ritualism, religiosity. And they said, we don't want any of this external paraphernalia of pujas and festivals and rituals and all that. They said, no, we must emphasize on recapturing the Vedic experience. That was the essence of the Upanishads. So what we call is the synthesis of the Vedas. So what was magnificent was these rishis, they went into the forest, they did immense tapasya, they meditated, and then they re-experienced what the Vedas had said and had done. But this time the Upanishadic rishis said, they did not use language that was symbolic. They used a language which was intuitive. So I'm giving you these levels, you'll see the understanding. Vedas were revelations, the highest level. Then Upanishads were intuitive. That means their language was intuitive, less symbolic. Unlike the Vedas, it was purely metaphysical. So when you read the Isha Upanishad, you will see there's hardly any imagery. Of course, in the Chandogya and others, there is very little of imagery. But mostly intuitive truths given the same experience, but in a language much more understandable, approachable by the common man. Not the common man, at least the intellectual man. So what happened? These Vedic rishis, or the Upanishadic rishis, they really gave us the sacred lore, that means the sacred truth. So Upanishad, people have got their literal meaning, upa, ni, shad, means sitting near the master. That's what we all understand from our childhood. That means it was a kind of a one-to-one teaching, 1-to-5 teaching, 1-to-7 people teaching. It's not a mass of 60, 40, 50 people, no. It was a teaching very intimate. And sometimes it is not even a teaching, maybe you just meditate with your shishyas, with your disciples, 5 of you, 2 of you, 3 of you, 1 of you. But the teaching method was completely different. It was not a classroom teaching like this. It was not speaking to. It was sharing an extension of the consciousness. So a guru and acharya, a rishi may say, hey, in fact there are stories which we will narrate later. One guru sent one shishya saying, you go and take care of my cows. Because these shishyas means disciples and students, would live with the teacher, with the guru. They become part of his family. So you can imagine the wife of the guru, she became the mother. She took care of their daily needs. And the father, the guru, the master, took care of the spiritual needs. So it was a kind of a family living. It was not a classroom teaching. But what was beautiful there was, they could see the master in action on a day-to-day level. Because that is what Sriaurobinda, the mother, would tell us. One of the ways of teaching, the best part of teaching is example, by a living example. That's only the lowest level. The highest level is an influence. The master doesn't have to be sitting before you. He can be sitting in London and then influence. That's the influence. That's the highest level. But here in the Upanishadic time, the Vedic, the disciples, they could see. You see, sometimes it happens that I preach something, but I do something differently. I do not live up to my teachings or my preaching. So we may be a great, brilliant lecturer, professor in the university, but back at home, you may be the cruelest of husbands or the fathers or the sons or children. So this disparity between teaching and preaching becomes narrowed down. So the students really saw, experienced on a day-to-day basis what is a spiritual life. I mean, I can recollect that only. I can very well recollect that because I lived with one such master, the mother. We could see how she talked, how she walked, how she dealt, how she managed, how she replied. You know, in the Gita, there is a famous question by Arjuna to Krishna saying, "Oh Lord Krishna, tell us how does a spiritual man walk and talk and eat and sleep?" Because we want to see the externalities, the external action. And that's what we could see with the mother. So it's not just a teaching, we have to see the person in life. And that was the advantage we had. When she came to the playground, when she went to the sports ground, when she was holding the string for the 100 meters running, how she used to take care, a little notebook and say who has come first, who has come second. Management. So you see, that was the great advantage of seeing the mother in action in life. Just like we had this same experience in the Upanishadic time. So this is the way trend that the Upanishads were not just sitting near and listening to the master. the master gave the secret. It's called Upanishad is also the sacred lore. It also means the sacred teaching. It's not just sitting near I can have all the Bhavardari. Bhavardari is what? Gossip. So sitting near each other you can gossip. No. It was giving the secret lore, passing on the consciousness. Yeah, when I use the word passing on the consciousness, again I remember the mother. Sitting in front of her, what did we feel? There are no words, no bhavardari, no gossip, no chat. And yet, a whole immense expansion of consciousness or self-forgetfulness. That happened right the moment we went in front of her. So that's what is a spiritual master. He elevates you to such dimension that you forget your own little individual ego self. So imagine day after day, these little young, not little, maybe young students sitting near the master, sometimes quietly, sometimes meditating, sometimes talking. There's no reading. So that is how they groomed a spiritual learner. So that was the time of the Upanishads, where the revelations were more intuitive, writings more philosophic, and obviously in a culture that is spreading at the time, from such a fund of knowledge, experiential knowledge, then came the high intellect, what we call the illumined mind. In Aurobindo, those of you who have read, we know revelation, intuition, there is the illumined mind. Then lower, then is the higher mind, lower, then is the mind. So we are now at the third level, the illumined mind. The illumined mind or the level of the schools of Indian philosophy. There were several schools, but these schools, like we have Sankhya and we have Yoga, we have all these systems of schools, they grabbed this knowledge from the Upanishads and they brought it to their own experience. But mind you, each of the schools was not started by a professor, not the head of the department, not a vice chancellor. Each of the schools, it was started again by a rishi. But what is it you are seeing? From a Unitarian consciousness of the Vedic rishis, who were a handful, there came many more Upanishadic rishis. And from this number of Upanishadic rishis, there came about many more rishis who started schools of thought. And this is not just a normal school of thought. You cannot see the Patanjali Yoga, you cannot have Sankhya Yoga, because these are yogas started by great rishis. And what is the inspiration of the rishis? The Upanishads. And the Upanishads have such a great variety. It's not a monotonous thing, as you will see when you go to the classes. Somebody dealing with death, somebody dealing with life, somebody dealing with senses, somebody dealing with head, somebody dealing with transformation. I mean, each Upanishad is a mystery, is a magic, is a sacredness. So some of these great rishis of the schools of thought, somebody caught the senses, somebody caught the mind, somebody caught death, somebody caught this. And you have a variety of schools of Indian thought, each emphasizing on a different aspect. And from those varieties of Indian thought, there came about varieties of yogas. What you call the Ashtanga Yoga, what we call Raja Yoga, what you call this yoga. Because yoga was the practical thing. So you see how the whole thing is beautifully developing, in the sense it is widening, so that it can come to the common man more and more. So this These Upanishads were split into many schools of thought, and the language was illumined thought. That means it was philosophic, no more metaphysical and abstract. So students of philosophy, they started joining the school. And the Indian mind became a very rich, illumined mind thought. But then, this lasted for long many years. But you see, what is the trend? Vedas were the united, Upanishads already were wider, the schools of thought many, and when they became many, you can imagine the tussle, the competition, the quarrel, who is better, who is greater, the competition comes in. So again there was a splitting of the Indian consciousness, and at that period comes the second synthesis, the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna. I mean, I'm amazed to see a culture that's going beyond 10,000 years has had such a planned evolution of consciousness, or what we call devolution of consciousness. So Lord Krishna in this Bhagavad Gita is not just a book, it's not a scripture. A lot of us think it's an Indian scripture. No, we humans require some support. And also we try to put everything into some mold. We say it's a religion, so religion means a guru, a scripture, a church. So these three form a religion. So we are trying to put Hinduism into this, saying, oh, Hinduism has a scripture here. Who is the guru? Who is the master? Is there a Christ? Is there a Muhammad? There we have a problem. Hinduism doesn't have one guru or one founder. You may have scriptures, but there is no founder of Hinduism. So it was very difficult for these philosophers to pack up Hinduism into a religionism. However, coming back to our story, the Bhagavad Gita once again brings in the synthesis. You see how I want you to remember only one thing, the synthesis. The greatest synthesis was the Vedas. Next comes Upanishads after a period of dissolution of all the rituals. After the Upanishads, again there is a dissolution of the sense of unity. So comes the Bhagavad Gita. So Sri Krishna himself builds in a lot of Sankhya, a lot of yoga. And it is said to be the saramsh, the summary, the synthesis of all the Upanishads. So we have a beautiful synthesis in the Upanishads. That's why there is philosophy, there is yoga, because it had to be philosophical, because he is taking in all the schools of philosophy. You see, Lord Krishna is a brilliant analysis. You may say, how in these 700 verses, and in front of the battlefield he has done that. Well, that's a different story. But there is a philosophy of all the schools of philosophy, major schools. There is the essence of the Upanishads. There is the essence of the Vedas. And most beautifully, there is the third aspect which is not there in the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas, the personal inhabitant divine, immanent divine. In the Vedas and in the Upanishads, there is no immanent divine. There is only the Brahman up there, the creator, the great Nirguna and the Saguna Brahman. But where is God? Where is the immanent divine? How can I catch him? How can I talk to him? How can I really embrace him? Because human beings are not all intellectuals. We don't like to meditate all the time. When the Upanishads and the Vedas say, hey, you've got to meditate and then only achieve Brahman. But I am not the meditative type. I am the devotional type. So where do I get the connect with the divine? The Vedas did not provide that clue. The Upanishads don't provide a clue. And here is the Master, Lord Krishna, who brings in the personal divine and says, hey, I am within you. You don't have to go up in those heavens and say, hey, Brahman, where are you? He says, I am downright right in front of you and within you in your own heart. Find me there. As a mother later on would say, go deep inside the temple and you will find me there. This is true because this is how and when most of the Indian temples started taking birth and they started getting constructed. You will see in the Indian TV lots of channels which are showing about the Indian temples, which are thousands of years old. But what is the essence? The essence is that in the sanctum sanctorum is the God, is the goddess. And that God or goddess is nothing but our psychic being. It was only a physical representation, manifestation of the human being's reality. That is how we in Sriaurobindostudies have got a psychology which tells you about the subliminal and this and this and that. And the seventh door is the psychic being. Similarly, if you go into any South Indian temples, you will have to cross those 7 doors, step over 7 doors, and then you will see the sanctum sanctorum. In the darkness, in the dark cave, a beautiful golden Lord is there. But even that's not much visible. You have to have eyes to see the Lord. You have to have that vision. So it is only through a great tapasya. It's not just moving from door to door and you say, hey, I don't see the statue of Shiva, I don't see this Nataraja. When the Puducherry says, the Brahmin says, do you have the eyes to see him? So here Sri Krishna brought in the sense of the personal Godhead and the immanent divine. So you see how Indian culture has gone from the mind, the revelation, intuition, illumined mind to the psychic being. Zoop, it goes in. And there is the birth of the devotees, the period of the devotees. For thousands of years, millions of devotees were born. And you have a number of them galore, east, west, north, south. There's no stopping it. They became devotees, songs, devotional, bhakti songs, these great names like Andal and Mirabai and Tukaram and all. Every region, every prant, every villager has their own devotee, a great devotee. Kabir Das. You must have, some of you might have seen, heard his programs when Kabir Das program came here. I mean, these devotees not only were God-oriented, but they impacted the society very much because they wanted always to bring in a unity between the social groups. So they were not alienated, isolated God lovers. They also contributed to the society. And this was a period that lasted for centuries. Now, having mastered the mental level, the psychic and the heart level, there comes in a kind of a lull. There comes in a kind of a pause in this devolution of Indian spirituality. Why did it come? This was the time when we went into invasions. The Mughals, the Britishers, they all came and really rampaged Indian culture. Of course, you may say we have got contributions of their temples and their forts and their art. But Indian psyche was more bothered to really to safeguard its culture. So it produced devotees, it produced movements, it produced people, social reformers, to see that this spiritual culture doesn't get disturbed. And that is one of the amazing things you will see in spite of hundreds of years of a foreign rulers. Indian culture remained the same. The other day, there was a talk by somebody who had done a research on Dara Sukho, Aurangzeb's elder brother. Dara Sukho, being a Muslim king, not yet a king, he was a prince. He was one who had translated the Upanishads, the first one to translate the Upanishads from Sanskrit to Persian. From Persian it went to the West in English. So they have contributed immensely, we are not denigrating them. But this was the period when this Upanishadic truths through the kings, they spread. There was a mingling of Indian society. But Sri Aurobindo would say, there's a kind of a pause, a lull. Because now the period was, obviously the mind, the heart, and the truth has to be fought out, brought down into the physical level. And there was no great rishi, there was no great philosopher, there was no great guru who emphasized on the physical. We all thought of going back to the old, meditating on the Brahman, going to the temple, getting this Lord Krishna's darshan or Vishnu's darshan or Ram darshan. But hardly anyone spoke saying, no, what about this body? You said that the body is also Brahman, it is also created by the divine. And yet you hate the body because it has got a fever, it has got ailment, it has got cancer. It says the body is meant for death, let it die forever, we don't bother. The first one to challenge this eternal, perennial Ganges of negation against the body is Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo said, no. With all due respect to the Vedic rishis and the Upanishadic rishis, who never denigrated the body, but down the line, all the yogis and the sannyasis taught disrespect to body. They suffered it because it does not give you the divinity. The Sri Aurobindo went against this Gangetic flow of these eons of centuries. Imagine one man who stands against the current of Indian society, Indian culture, which has lasted for thousands of years, and he said, no, body is and can be immortal. And for that, whatever needs to be done, I shall do. And he said the first thing that he wanted to do was the transformation of the physical. For that, what is required? Nothing short of the supermind. All the powers till the level of overmind were good enough to give you that religiosity, that sense of oneness, that sense of devotion, that sense of Brahman. But in spite of all the greatness of Krishna and Rama and all the gurus in the world, body was neglected. Body was neglected, matter was neglected. So that is why we bow down to Sri Aurobindo, who has been like a Shiva standing against this flow of this perennial Indian negativity for thousands of years. So he brought down, he worked for it, did the tapasya from 1910 to 1950 for 40 years. He did the tapasya. People may think he was there a recluse, a sannyasin, giving up the world. But you see all those volumes that are there. He was not a recluse. And the amount of writing he has done. To one disciple he wrote 9,000 letters, Dilip Kumar Roy. And hundreds of letters. He hardly slept, it seems, because he had so much to write and reply. What was he doing? He was working for the liberation of humanity. He was working for the transformation of physical life. You may say, well, it's almost hyperbolic to say body can be immortal. Yes, for us it is. We may not believe it, but somebody has done something. The mother carried on the work given by Sri Aurobindo, started by Sri Aurobindo. And I read recently somewhere a very powerful sentence from Sri Aurobindo, who says the first work of the supramental consciousness or power is to destroy the molds of the mind. In all, he says, to destroy all the molds of the mind, including culture, religion, morality, education. Because until and unless these are struck down, the new consciousness cannot build a new world. And friends, go back into history and you see the meaning of this striking down these old molds of the mind. That's why today humanity is in a big mess, because it's neither got the new truth and is getting loosened up from the old truth. The poor challenging the rich, the weaker countries becoming rich and powerful, the children going against the parents' morality. There's no sense of morality. People are crying hoarse. Education is all rotten. All the great Macaulay education in India is being thrown into the dustbin. Because he said, all the molds of the minds will be struck down. That's the first work of the supermind. I was aghast. And I could not have agreed with him more. Because look around the world, this is the pralaya that is taking place. We have heard so much about pralaya, the destruction. It's already there. It doesn't have to be Noah's Ark story and then somebody comes and saves. Here is the Noah's Ark prepared by Sri Aurobindo. That's what the mother saw in her dream, a huge ship going from this world to the supramental world, and some people are getting onto that, and Nirodbaran was one of those candidates, the ship. So there is a Noah's Ark that has been built, journeying to the supramental world, and that Noah's Ark, or Sri Aurobindo's Ark, is taking some people across. Do you want to jump on that or not? That's what the mother had written to me when I wanted to go to the United States of America to do my further studies. She said, stay here and prepare yourself for the new consciousness that is coming down. So it was a question of wanting to get onto the new boat, the new Noah's Ark or not. So do not be surprised, do not be shocked with all that is happening in the world. Because Sri Aurobindo has brought down the supermind, which wants to destroy the molds of the mind and liberate us from this tremendous molds of the mind and sink into the physical. So there is a consciousness of the physical, of the beauty, of the maintenance, of health, of gymnastics, of work, of walking, everywhere. So at last, the whole descent has completed. What the Vedic Rishi started on the supreme level of the mind, the Upanishad is the second synthesis, Gita is the third synthesis, Sri Aurobindo is the grand synthesis. You open Sri Aurobindo, you have everything in him. The Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Vedas. You have the mass of that, and you have the heights of that, and you have the depths of that. So to reach Sri Aurobindo is not only a privilege, but we in India would say, because you have done some punya in your past birth, that you have been able to reach Sri Aurobindo in this life. That's what we in India will believe. Because of your good work, your aspiration, that you are able to touch these beautiful, extraordinary writings. So here is the whole cycle of Indian society. And from now, as Sri Aurobindo says, the spiral will begin into a new Satya Yoga. The whole thing has come down and there's a swing back to Satya Yoga. And friend, this is where is the Upanishad. So what we read in the Savitri is the synthesis of all that has gone before it. It's not just a story. It's not just symbolism. It's not just Integralyoga. It is the whole of mankind's spiritual efforts that have been put into that Savitri. And having had a glimpse of it, a taste of it, I'd like to take you back into another synthesis. There was a debate in the class last time to take up Gita or the Upanishad. But ultimately, we decided on taking up the Upanishad. And so I will give you a few introductory talks. Today I have given you a very broad picture of where is the position of the Upanishads in the hierarchy of Indian spirituality. So now you have a whole global picture. So when I refer to the Gita or when I refer to the Upanishads, you will know of what level I am speaking. And now you will know where you are in Aurobindo. Why is it that the mother wants the truth to be the physical, not emphasizing on meditation and devotion? That's why she said Aurobindo is based on Karma Yoga of Sri-Aurobindo, not Dhyana Yoga or not Raj Yoga. Karma, the work with matter, because his truth has to come down to the level of matter. Vedas have to be manifested, remanifested in matter. And Sri-Aurobindo is that person, is that yogi, is that rishi who is fulfilling what the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Gita left incomplete. There are hundreds of gurus in India, but they all speak of the past. The great glory is in the past, but the glory that awaits us in the future is indescribable, incomparable. You can't even place it with the old. So that's why a lot of us get confused. My God, can there be something greater than the Gita, better than the Upanishads, better than the Veda? But I believe truth is greater than all these Vedas and the Gitas and the Upanishads. That's what Lord Krishna himself said. That when there are no rains, when there is dearth of knowledge, you go to a school of thought. When you are thirsty, you go to a well. But when there is a deluge, what's the use of the well? There is water everywhere. And that deluge is the supreme. At present, the wells are the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Gita. Those who are thirsty of spiritual knowledge, we go to that. But Sri-Aurobindo has brought down the supramental deluge. 1956, all of you know, the deluge of the Superman has descended upon earth. So the consciousness is everywhere. So we don't have to go to the wells called the Vedas, wells called this. But still, we can understand these Upanishads. And then I'm particularly interested in taking up the Upanishads for one more reason. The amount of common thought between the Upanishads and Sri-Aurobindo. You will be amazed that all that has been spoken of, not all, most of all, both by Mother and Sri-Aurobindo have their bija mantra, have their seed thought in the Upanishads or the Vedas. You cannot escape that. Even Sri-Aurobindo could not escape it. He has given it a modern terminology and modern essence, but the Bij Mantra is there. So it is a great discovery to see what the Upanishads are. And then we'll enjoy them more because we know a bit of Sri-Aurobindo. And that's why the Upanishads are a marvel. And we will understand Sri-Aurobindo better. That is one of my intentions of wanting to take up the Upanishads. And I hope we'll enjoy. It's a tough reading. Not that my Sanskrit is next to zero. My Sanskrit is next to zero, but still, fortunately, Sri-Aurobindo has given us wonderful translations, equivalents, and we will wade through the Upanishads. But yeah, you need to have patience, you need to be having a little more imagination, because there are no figures of Savitri and Ashwapati and Satyavan and all that. It's pure knowledge per se. Well, that's the introduction to the Upanishads. I hope I've given you the global map, the GSP or what do you call that. And after this, next time I'll take up the Upanishads again in general. But what really deeply moved me was that what we did in Savitri, the Integralyoga. Aurobindo says it is there in the Upanishads, including your great Integralyoga which you speak, oh Allah Aurobindo. In all his humilities, he says it is found in the Upanishads. So it is natural that we take up Upanishads as a study. Yeah, thank you. We'll have a concentration now.